Welcome, everybody, to this series on women storytellers. With me today is my friend, Dr. Mira Mohsini. Mira is a South Asian American with family connections to both India and Pakistan. For over 15 years, Mira has worked as an educator and researcher. She has taught college courses on race and racism, gender and sexuality, Islam and Muslim societies, globalization and consumption, a course called Magic, Myth, and Religion, research methods, and even a course on ghosts. As a cultural anthropologist, she has worked with Muslim minority communities in India, as well as nonprofits along the Indo-Nepal border, central India, and Pakistan. She is working currently as a senior researcher at the Coalition of Communities of Color in Portland, Oregon. Her first publication with the Coalition of Communities of Color was a report on police violence in Portland during the recent uprisings for racial justice following the death of George Floyd. Outside of her work, Mira is writing a piece of fiction called The Revelers, about how a mysterious centuries-old family archive holds the key to generational struggles for liberation. Mira has a PhD in Cultural Anthropology from the University of London in the UK and an MA in Anthropology and International Development from the London School of Economics. Welcome, Mira. I really appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you, Tanya. It's great to be here.
So I wanted to ask you a few questions, Mira, about how you use storytelling in your work and in your life. And first of all, I wanted to know, do you consider yourself a writer or a storyteller?
That's a great question. I never actually thought of myself as a writer before you invited me to come on this series. And I'd always thought of myself as a storyteller because as an anthropologist, we embed ourselves, or we live for years with communities in order to be able to tell stories that are often not told or not heard. So writing has always been a part of my professional life, and I've really enjoyed writing in my personal life, although I never thought about it as like an identity. Because I'm an anthropologist, I think of myself more as a storyteller.
Can you go a little bit more into how that happens?
Anthropology is very much about um, living with and gaining experience with communities for a long period of time. And so we call that, part of the methods that we use in anthropology is, one of them is called participant observation. So we participate in everyday life of folks we're living with, and we also observe, right? And so I think participation and observation are really key components to storytelling, to telling a really powerful narrative and a powerful story. And so that is the crux of anthropology, is participant observation. With this method that we use in the field, and by field I mean wherever we're studying, we get to experience the everyday lives of folks in a very often intimate way. And so that really gives us the fodder for a lot of stories that, like I said before, often don't get told. This type of storytelling is important. It often is political, and when I say political, I mean that it brings to the foreground the experiences of folks that often are in positions of being disempowered. And when I say disempowered, I mean, because of history and systems of oppression, been they've historically been put in a place where their voice doesn't matter, or their voice is never heard. And so I think anthropology and the storytelling that emerges out of cultural anthropology can really bring those voices and those stories particularly to people's attention.
So that's great that you mentioned the participant observer part of cultural anthropology. I was looking up cultural anthropology yesterday because I remember, so Mira and I studied together at the London School of Economics, and we had one of our teachers who had embedded himself in kind of gang culture, and that had brought up a lot of issues around being a participant in that culture. So my question to you, Mira, is there's a lot of controversy around this participant observation and how one can become a part of the story that you're actually telling and thereby change the story. So I wanted to get your take on that. Is it appropriate to become a part of the story and to change that story? Or is it something that you try to avoid?
My PhD supervisor told me once, and this has always stayed in my mind, is that you can never be an objective observer. You are always part of the story, and that's what you bring as a storyteller. It's your perspective only. If a second anthropologist went in to study the same community into the same field, they would have a totally different story. And that, I think, is the beauty of anthropology, is that it is from your lens. It's from your perspective. It's from you bring your own biography into the storytelling. And of course, in when we study the ethics around fieldwork, we talk a lot about really examining our what we call positionality and ensuring that we interrogate all our position, our points of privilege. We hold, as anthropologists, as academics, we often go into a field of study, or we often go into a community holding quite a bit of power, even as graduate students. We're affiliated with universities. We often come with funding. We hold positions of power in that field, and it's really important for us to recognize that and not to exploit that. So when when you were recalling one of our professors who was working with gangs, or there are anthropologists and sociologists who work with with the drug trade and interact quite often with drug dealers. There are anthropologists who work on issues of migration and often interact quite intimately with smugglers, human traffickers. These types of interactions are, they're fraught with a lot of ethical dilemmas into what happens, for instance, when you're witness to something, to a crime, to something illegal. What do you do? Do you forsake your role as a storyteller, and now do you go to the police and potentially compromise your relationship to what we call an informant? Or do you not go to the police and maintain the relationship for the sake of storytelling? And so anthropologists who work in these types of situations face those dilemmas and often write about them. And it can go both ways. I've read stories of anthropologists who have reported witnessing criminal activities, and I've read anthropologists who have not and have continued their relationship with the community.
But you haven't yourself, based on the literature that you've sent me that you've written, you haven't yourself been involved in witnessing crimes, have you?
No, I haven't. That was never part of my fieldwork experience.
The stories that you tell, the ones that you have sent me, are very interesting about people who are marginalized and perhaps victimized in the bigger institutions of society. What makes you the right person to tell these stories?
I can answer that question from a very personal perspective. So as you mentioned in your introduction, when you were reading my bio, I identify as South Asian American. I have connections, like you said, to India and Pakistan. My family is also Muslim. My dad's family is Indian Muslim, so they're Muslims from India. My mom's family, Muslim from Pakistan. And those two identities, even though they are both, Muslim identities, because they are situated in two different nation states, there are two different experiences going on there. So Indian Muslims are a minority population, and they're a marginalized population, and they have been experiencing increasing forms of stigmatization in India. The reason I say this is because the community that I worked with in India are also Muslim. They're Muslim artisans. Now, when I think about myself and when I think about the folks who I worked with, those Muslim artisans, and we don't hold the same class position. The Muslim artisans that I worked with, you would probably call them working class. I come from a middle class Muslim family, so we don't hold the same class positions, but I understand, uh, and I've lived in an embodied way, that identity, parts of that identity. Now I can't claim to understand the full experience of what it means to be a working class Muslim artisan living in the old city of Delhi, which is where I did my research, but I share some affinity in identity in terms of identity that I think puts me in a place where I can listen empathetically. Um, I can use my experience and my background to create connections with folks because those folks who are marginalized and who are on an everyday basis stigmatized by uh, you know by broader society, they in order for them to survive, they have to be careful about who they trust, and they often don't trust outsiders coming into their communities and saying, hey, let me interview you and tell the world your story. That immediately puts up some red flags because those types of stories have often been weaponized against them. So my background as somebody who is Muslim, who is Indian, you know that created a basis for trust because they could recognize a familiarity in me. And so I think that those points of identification became really important for me to be able to tell certain stories about them.
We've talked a little bit about how you use storytelling in your work as a cultural anthropologist. I'm wondering about how that applies to your role as an educator.
Storytelling as an educator is is a fantastic way to engage students. At the beginning of the semester, I always do some sort of icebreaker, which to get to know students, which opens the space of the classroom for students to be their own storytellers. Um, and I think storytelling, whether it's tell me about one of the more general questions I would ask is, tell me about something interesting that happened to you over the summer, or um, tell me something that's in your fridge and then tell me why you chose that thing, right? Like, what is the story behind you choosing that piece of cheese that's in your fridge? So stories create connections, and I think in a classroom setting, creating connections between the teacher and the student is so important. I don't believe that the most effective way to teach is if the teacher has it is really in a dominant position, has so much authority that there's no connectivity between teacher and student. I really believe in flattening out that relationship as much as possible, and I think storytelling and sharing of stories is one way to achieve that kind of more democratic space within the classroom. Storytelling, the second thing I want to say about storytelling as an educator is that so much of the material that I teach can be very conceptual, can be very theoretical. And I think connecting those theories and those concepts of anthropology and cultural anthropology and social theory to stories about how this relates to people's everyday life is really powerful as a pedagogical tool for gaining clarity around these sort of theoretical concepts that are often hard to understand. So storytelling is a powerful pedagogical tool to you know um, help students better understand the material.
So, for the YouTubers out there like myself who might need to look up the word pedagogical, could you define that?
Pedagogical is essentially like when we talk about ways of teaching, we'll say that this is my pedagogy. It just refers to, it's just like it's one of those fancy sounding words that actually has a really simple meaning. It just means way of teaching.
Thanks so much. As an educator, any educator, there is a job of carrying a narrative and delivering it to students to impart on them a body of knowledge. So, in what way do you carry the narrative, and what do you think about that?
Okay, so when I use storytelling as an educator, what I want to share with my students is the power of stories uh, from those experiences that we often don't hear about, right? So that I think is like is one of the things that anthropology brings to the table, is that it often shares stories that are not the dominant narrative that we hear, because they are stories of often folks who don't have power. I use narrative and I use storytelling in an almost to counter the dominant ways in which the canon, or those formative ways of understanding the world, kind of tell us that this is how you should understand the world. And storytelling can be a powerful, like, countercultural to that, or counter narrative to that dominant way that all that we grow up with, that we're socialized to understand the world in a particular way. And I think the power of storytelling can be like, okay, there are so many other ways that we can understand the world, and that's how I like to use storytelling as an educator. And I have, in those classes, I have a lot of students of color.
So, in the context of education, Mira, you said that storytelling is a way to make connections between people. I'm curious if, in other professional contexts that you've worked in as an anthropologist or as a researcher, or even in your personal life, if you can talk about the ways that storytelling makes connections between people or groups of people, and whether that can be also a means of social or political change.
As a researcher who is now working outside of academia, I definitely see how the power of storytelling can have, potential for social change. So I can give you the example of the the report that you mentioned in your introduction, that I wrote recently about police violence that has been ongoing here in Portland, Oregon, where I live, as a response to the protests for Black Lives Matter and racial justice. The report that I wrote was based on a lot of crowdsourced data that a partner organization that I'm working with collected over the course. Well, it's been collecting this data for several years, but it's been collecting a lot of data that's been coming out of the protests, and these are protesters telling their own stories about what they've experienced on the streets. And so when I wrote that report, I could have either just given some really powerful numbers that show that these are the percentages of protesters who have been seriously injured by so-called non-lethal munitions that police are using. My report could have been just numbers and charts, and that would have been powerful in itself. What I and my colleagues decided to do is that we wanted to create narrative around these numbers. We wanted to include the very detailed, very descriptive stories that were coming into us about, and also, frankly, very graphic stories about how protesters were being treated on the streets, what they were going through, how they were being specifically targeted by police officers, especially if they were medics. And as you know, medics and legal observers, they wear badges that are very visible, right? And they were sharing with us their stories of being specifically targeted, because typically, in a civil unrest situation, police and other authorities are, the practice is you're not supposed to target medics, right, and legal observers, but nevertheless, we heard stories of them being targeted. And so we wanted to contextualize and make more powerful these already powerful numbers that were coming out from this data, and including in this report these really detailed and often graphic stories, in addition to pictures and photographs that were being submitted. This all created a story. And it was a powerful story. And it was a story that was eventually sent to elected officials. It was a story that was being sent to organizers. It was a story that was being sent to a whole range of folks in various positions of power who have various abilities to influence decision making. And the real humanization of numbers, I think, is a really powerful aspect of storytelling. That we have numbers that can tell a story, and then we have actual human words and human experiences that elaborate on the story that those numbers tell. And I think that's the real power when you're talking about the power of storytelling to create social change. I think that is that humanization of data specifically is really important.
I would have to agree with you. I was reading the report that you wrote, and it was a very difficult read. Not because it was academic language or anything, but because of the graphic nature and the personal stories that were being shared. And to think that these things were still possibly ongoing on the streets in Portland was a very difficult thing to read. And I have to admit, I got a little bit concerned for you. And I wonder whether, in telling, you've got this report out there and your name is on the top of it. I wonder if, in doing storytelling in these contexts where you're taking on a pretty powerful institution, do you have any fear for yourself or for your partner, that there can be repercussions?
I will say it has crossed my mind, especially with this report, but not only with this report. I for many years I was writing about the work that I did in India with Muslim minority populations, and I was very explicit about my position regarding the political context, the political situation in India, which, as those of you who may follow Indian politics might know, that what we're seeing there is a rise of very right-wing Hindu nationalism. And so I was writing from the perspective of very marginalized Muslim populations. And so from that position, of course, I'm going to critique this, the political establishment there. And I necessarily had to. And I did wonder that, am I going to get put on some no-fly list, or am I going to be targeted in some way? I've been involved in politics and in various degrees of organizing from a grassroots perspective. And so every time that I'm involved, whether it's in organizing an action or a protest, or whether it's writing an academic paper or writing a report like this one on police violence, I absolutely do. It does cross my mind about the safety concerns. And I also feel very strongly that the story needs to be told. And I think that I am in various ways protected by, the institutions that I belong to, the organizations that I belong to a certain degree, protect me. My position as someone who, although I identify as a person of color, I also have other privileges in my, in my identity that, to a certain extent, protect me. I'm not, at the moment at least, I'm not financially insecure, for instance. I have a house. So I'm not, I have a stable living condition. And these are things that do provide protection.
Yeah, I think that we have this idea that press, in terms of, journalism and telling the facts, the who, what, when, where, why, and how of a story, um, divorces the writer or the journalist from storyteller, from any opinion, and therefore they're safe. But there have been so many journalists killed for breaking a story And you even point out in Portland that right now journalists are being targeted on the streets. Just telling the story can sometimes be a dangerous thing. So we've already looked at how your unique social identity impacts the stories that you gather and tell. But I'm wondering if there's a way in which it impacts the way the stories can be told.
I think absolutely it can impact the way that story is told. So I'll give you an example. I grew up reading and being really interested in reading stories from an immigrant perspective. So, my parents immigrated to Canada, and I was born in Canada actually, and then we moved to the U.S. So, we moved around a lot, and so there was that this immigrant experience, and I sought out books that I had hoped could reflect my experience. And there were some that did, to some extent, but I never found in reading books written by immigrants, and specifically, South Asian, Indian or Pakistani immigrants, or those who have had that experience. I never really connected with those stories actually, because they didn't reflect my life. And so this is one of the reasons why I started writing the fiction story that you mentioned in the bio called The Revelers, because I wanted to tell my story, and I wanted to tell something that reflected my experience of what it was like to grow up with parents who are immigrants. So I think there is value to telling your story from your own personal position and your own, how you identify, because that story has never been told. I never found myself reflected, as I said, in so-called the immigrant genre, or whatever you want to call it. Um, that's because I never told that story. I never told my story, and maybe my story will resonate a little bit with somebody else, and parts of it won't resonate. Um, so there is a very unique individual perspective, I think, that comes through storytelling that can resonate on a more universal level. And then there are particularities that are so fascinating and interesting and unique to each individual that I believe really need to be shared with the world through storytelling.
So we've talked about the ways that storytelling is a part of your professional life, but there may be some less obvious ways that it comes into your professional working life. I'm also curious about how storytelling is a part of your personal life.
I grew up with a lot of storytelling. My parents immigrated from India and Pakistan to Canada, and one of the ways to keep their memories about their place of origin and their place of birth was through storytelling. So I grew up with so many stories. My dad would tell me stories about how he was the captain of the cricket team when he was in high school, and how he would get how he lost his two front teeth when he was playing cricket. My mom used to tell me about stories about when she was in the drama club and used to dress up as men, because these were all female drama groups, and they needed someone to play the male character. So my mom would do that. And it created, for me personally, it created a connection to a place that I had really no physical experience of. And it was through those stories I really felt that I could better understand my own cultural background, my own sense of who I am. And there's a sadness associated with it, because I can only really know about a place through storytelling, and there's just a great level of imagination that now I can kind of imagine being there, and imagine a different time. My mom grew up in the 50s and 60s, and so I can imagine a different time. So that's how storytelling has really been a part of my life. And not only storytelling, but or I would say, in addition to storytelling, poetry. I always found it amazing how my parents, because they grew up with their parents just telling them all kinds of poems, right? Because poems are a way to express bigger issues, sometimes around love, but also sometimes around politics. And I just remember my dad would, we would be talking about something and he would just remember this one couplet from a poem and just say it. And that one couplet would just reveal so much to me about what we were talking about. So I think like poetry is as a form of storytelling is really powerful too. And I grew up with that. So I feel really fortunate.
What drives you to tell stories?
Storytelling it creates connections. It creates an understanding of people and experiences that you may have certain assumptions about, like, because we get stories from all sources, and the stories that come from institutions like the media that have a lot of power often shape the way that we understand other communities and other people. Storytelling from the ground up or from a different perspective can counter those often like stereotypes that we hear, and I think that's really powerful. And of course, I think what attracts me and drives me to storytelling is its power for social change, is its power to humanize people and communities that are often dehumanized and just thought of in terms of in stereotypical ways. I just thought of, for instance, as violent, or as we often hear immigrants being portrayed in very harmful ways, and so storytelling can counter those harmful narratives, and that's what drives me to storytelling ultimately.
Wonderful. As a storyteller, for what are you most grateful?
As a storyteller, I'm most grateful for having the opportunities to travel and to be around so many different cultures and communities and to learn from others. And those experiences really inform and shape the ways that I tell stories.
We haven't had a chance to talk very much about Mira's writing, but I'll give a link in the description box to some pieces that she has offered for us. We're going to have a real treat now to hear Mira read from one of her pieces. Mira, would you like to introduce it?
So thank you. So the article that I want to share is one that I wrote for the Huffington Post, and it's the story of two artisans that I worked with during my fieldwork in Old Delhi. The title of the piece is called "Who Made That Police Badge? The Shadow Lives of a Hidden Workforce." Have you ever thought about what makes up a police uniform? Have you noticed the badges on some police uniforms? Would it be surprising to know that a Canadian police badge was embroidered by a woman named Rana Begum in the courtyard of a dilapidated housing complex in the old city of Delhi in India? Zoom out and you'll find Rana's husband, Mohammed, seated behind her, embroidering the same badge on a 2-foot karchob or wooden frame. I've shown these pictures to my undergraduate students and have asked them the same questions. I teach an Introduction to Cultural Anthropology class where the topic of globalization and its impact on communities around the world takes up a significant part of the semester. During one class exercise, I ask students to do a label check on something they have with them. In other words, to find out where it's made. Most students are surprised that India, Vietnam, and Turkey are more common places of production than the United States. I've done this exercise a handful of times, and I'm always intrigued by how little is known about the places from where our t-shirts, jeans, and backpacks are made, and about the lives of the people who make them. Even after over 40 years of large-scale manufacturing outsourcing to the global south, the dynamics of supply chains remain opaque at best. A recent article in Quartz reveals that many of the goods we use and encounter on a daily basis, especially textiles and clothes, are not made in factories, as is often assumed, but by workers in their homes. Known as fashion's hidden workforce, it's estimated that India alone has at least 12 million home-based garment workers that produce for local and international brands. The article also profiles one embroiderer who is a member of an Indian trade union for home-based textile workers, one of the few in the country. But the majority of home-based workers are not unionized or members of trade organizations. And it's not only brand name clothes, H&M t-shirts or Gap jeans, that are made by these workers. Items that we never think twice about, like police badges, are also made in homes all over the world by people like Rana and Mohammed. Yet we know very little about this workforce. What are their lives like? How do they feel about what they do? What are their aspirations and frustrations? As an anthropologist, I'm most interested in these questions, and so I spent a lot of time thinking about Rana and Mohammed.
I really enjoyed that piece. It reminded me of many of the people I met in my travels in India as well, and it's surprising to me that people don't know more about the global supply chain. And I hope that perhaps we've educated some people today. And again, I'm going to give a link to the rest of the article in the description box. I want to thank you so much, Mira, for taking time to talk to us about your role as a storyteller. And I hope that people will find it a treat to read your writing in the description box below. I'm really looking forward to the fiction piece as well.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure to talk with you, Tanya, and I really appreciate this conversation.
Me too. If you liked this conversation today, why not give the video a thumbs up? And if you want to see more videos like this, if you want to see the rest of the series, then click subscribe. If you hit the bell icon, you'll be notified when I upload again. For what are you most grateful today?